Well, good morning. It's always nice at a FHIR conference to talk about HL7 version 2. Although, if you were to venture a guess by, let's say, the number of data points being transferred by HL7 version 2 versus the number of data points being transferred in FHIR, take a guess. Anyway, I don't know actually what the relationship is, but it's still quite a lot. Let's have a look at the mapping of version 2 to FHIR. And I kind of have a confession to make. I'm a trainer with FHIR, so I've actually spoken to this migration quite often. But I never did it myself. So we're just listening to other people who had done this mapping and learning their best practices and then presenting effectively what I had learned. And then last year I decided, okay, I'm not a fantastic programmer, that's years ago, but I thought, okay, let's do a bit of Python and a bit of quick hacking and let's do this. Let's translate version 2 to FHIR. And yes, indeed, I stumbled upon the same things that other people were stumbling upon. But I also discovered some other things that they never spoke about. So, some lessons learned of that process. So learning objectives is, yes, to learn some of those issues that you encounter when you translate HL7 version 2 to a CDR. There are multiple possible scenarios here, and I actually had a poll up for this session where I asked, okay, what sort of a translation are you aiming to do? And it turns out, and that's actually a bit of a surprise to me, but it is by far the easiest option, is to translate version 2 messages to FHIR messages. Because you have the same interoperability paradigm, the same exchange mechanism, and that, as you will see, makes life a lot easier. The second thing, we see quite a lot of that in the market right now, to populate your FHIR-based CDR with the data that's currently contained in version 2 messages. After all, there are millions of these messages per year, so why not reuse the data that's contained in them? And finally, the other way around, if I have a FHIR-based CDR that is populated by multiple sources, I may wish to export some of that data in the form of version 2 again. Now, the focus here in this talk is on the second scenario. So the translation of version 2 message content to a CDR. Now let's take an example scenario that I will use to illustrate the difficulties and issues with these translations. So as you can see, we have some sort of translator box, and we have a system that has trigger events, and it sends me an ADT feed, and I want to translate that for the resources to be included in a CDR. But to make it a bit more interesting, we're going to have two systems, so we're also going to have a lab system for lab results. So it's going to be a mix of two feeds to update a CDR. Seems like a reasonable scenario, right? Now, if you look at this translation issue and you look at a high level of abstraction, you go like, well, these version 2 segments, they're kind of resources, right? So I look at this version 2 message, ADT 804, and I go like, okay, so this is a message header FHIR resource, this is the patient resource, here we have an encounter resource, and here we have some allergy and tolerance resources. Done. Cool, easy. Well, yes and no. You do have the problem of having to translate the data elements, right? That's the first thing that you're going to look at. Are the data elements, the fields that I have in version 2, what's the corresponding stuff that I have on the FHIR side? So in that sense, doing this sort of segment level to FHIR resource translation is certainly a starting point in your translations. And luckily enough, notably the orders and observations group within the HL7 organization, they have already created spreadsheets and an implementation guide that shows you the mapping of most of the known to be used data elements in version 2. So you can just open up the spreadsheet, and for PID or NK1 or OBX, you can see what the direct mapping is of all of the fields that are contained in version 2. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because, hey, it's already there. That's actually the easy part of the translation. There are some other parts that are much more hairy. I will be looking at those specifically. Because you can already imagine, if you know version 2, and you're here so you know FHIR, okay, yeah, there are some problems in this mapping, but hey, more or less, this is doable. The problem mainly derives from the fact that messaging is a fundamentally different way of exchanging data than REST. So in messaging, it's always about now. Where is the patient now? What are the current active allergies? I don't care about any other allergies. Okay? So that's a bit of a problem because REST has a different philosophy. A REST CDR represents the state of the world. Everything that has gone on, is going on, shall go on if we have planned something. It's all in one single repository. And that's a fundamentally different way of viewing things, and that causes a lot of issues. Plus some other differences between the standard, but most of them derive from this difference. So actually doing a translation from version 2 messages to FHIR messages, I could basically stop my presentation right now. We would be done. Because the spreadsheets contain the actual translation. In FHIR messages, you can use the exact same trigger event codes that we had in HL7 version 2. There is a bit of an issue here, because if you then use HTTP to send this FHIR message somewhere, then obviously the receiving system has to have a message processor for FHIR messages. And I don't know of any system that has a $processed message. That's actually a predefined operation for this. But if you look at the standard, it says, well, this is the import operation. It doesn't tell you anything else. And there's actually quite a lot of complexity hidden behind that. But anyway, the fundamental difference, that's my takeaway message already. That fundamental difference, that's causing the problems. So let's look at that in a bit more detail, the scenario. So yes, we have some persistence layer, and we have an event detection mechanism, whatever it may be, and that generates a message, and we start encoding the message in pipe head syntax. Then we have to do the message decoding and the mapping, so this is my translation engine again. And then preferably we would use the FHIR API of some FHIR-based system. They would then merge the data that we are sending them with the data that's already in their persistence layer. That's kind of the preferred scenario. But what we're seeing quite a lot is people are not doing this, but they're doing this. So the translation box goes directly to the persistence layer of the destination system. Now you can imagine that that actually causes quite a lot of issues, because there is no business level validation anymore. Okay? I'm not talking about FHIR validation here. I'm talking about sanity checks. Does this fit in the workflow? Does this fit with our own internal application rules? That sort of stuff. So that's done if you send it via this route, but certainly not if it's sent directly this way. So be careful. Now, when we started thinking about translation from version 2 to FHIR, and that's around 2014, so 10 years ago we started working on that, we thought like, you know what? Actually, if the receiving system is not going to support messages, and that's relatively unlikely, FHIR messages, but let's use transaction bundles as a mechanism. It's actually kind of a neat mechanism. I have this set of statements, set of transactions, because I want to, in an A04, which is a new outpatient admit, as you know, or registration of a patient. So we're going to then have a create or update of the patient, because the patient may already be known on the destination system. We're going to create a new encounter. Hey, it's an A04, so it's a new registration, new outpatient encounter. And for the allergies, well, we may have to purge whatever the allergies are already known by the receiving system, and then replace them with the allergies that we have in this version 2 message. That's already one of the fundamental differences. Because version 2, as I said before, will only send you the active allergies. So if after this message you receive another message with just 2 allergies, then that means that the other allergy that's listed still here has gone inactive. But there is no easy way of detecting that. That's one of the differences. Anyway, transaction is a nice option. And also because transactions allow you to do these conditional REST operations. Because I don't know if this patient already exists in my CDR. So I have to do a conditional put to state, based on, let's say, social security number or medical record number or whatever it may be, create a new patient, but really only if that patient doesn't already exist, because then it will be an update. So it's an absurd, effectively. Okay, still thinking of this transaction ID, right? So you're going to look at this one. Now, if you know version 2, you're well familiar with this. This is PID3, the list of patient identifiers. Is that a unique identifier? Well, if you have seen this implemented, you know that there is a very high level of variability in usage here. Okay? That's a big problem. Obviously, this is patient.identifier. That's not really a secret. This is a CX data type, and it also lists some of the examples that you see in the wild. So this is used in all crazy ways. But this means if you turn that into an identifier data type in FHIR, in identifier you need to have system and identifier, right? So how do you get hold of the system? The system may, if it's done this way, then you have a pretty good idea as to what the system is, right? But here, there's so much variability in there, so how do you get hold of the system URI? You can state, I'm going to leave it empty, but in my implementation, I decided, no, I'm not ever going to leave that as an empty field. So I'm going to basically look at all of these fields and have some logic to combine all of that into a URL that identifies my identification system. If there is nothing in the CX data type, I use MSH3, which is the name of the sending application. And thus I am assuring that I always have a unique system and identifier pair, because otherwise you run into a lot of, well, identification issues. And version 2 doesn't have a lot of identifiers, so that whole mapping issue around identifiers is one of the key problems. But hey, let's say I create this, then I can do a conditional update based on that patient identifier. So identity management is certainly one of the main headaches. For example, logical identifiers, ID, well, how many logical identifiers are there in version 2? It's near zero. There are a few that you can actually see as, but those are in some fancy segments like diagnosis and procedures, and all the way at the end of the segment, nobody has ever implemented them, except for German implementations. There are some things that look like logical identifier, but in general, you never see this. But FHIR requires them. Aha, that's interesting. Okay, so identity management is one of the challenges. Okay, another example. So here we have PV117, so we're in the patient visit segment, and then we have a reference, actually, to a provider. And so in FHIR, there will be a practitioner resource, so you create a new practitioner resource, but create, maybe it's an update. It probably already exists. So I'm going to have to use this identifier, hopefully, to unambiguously map that particular thing to a new provider resource. Right? So avoidance of duplicates, that's another nightmare, but it's related to the fact that I have my identity management issue. Because in case of doubt, it may be very tempting to go like, okay, I got this provider somewhere or this practitioner, I don't know exactly if it already exists, create it again. So very quickly, this example that we just have, this Frank Jensen, this clinician, it will exist 20,000 times on your destination CDR. So be very careful. There is no way to avoid this. So I've seen approaches where people actually run after you've done your best to try and prevent duplicates, to periodically run, once a week or something, a specific duplicate detection thing on your FHIR repository to try and find out if there are duplicates in my system. Even though I tried, it's never going to be perfect. So duplicate detection, again, is something you need to be aware of. Allergies. This is one of the most famous problems when we talk about the mapping. I already alluded to that. We have 3 allergies here in this message for acetaminophen, oxycodone, and peanuts. And this is the list of active allergies. Okay? So if we receive another message with just 2, then apparently, let's say the first 2, then apparently peanuts is no longer an active allergy. But how do we deal with that in the context of translation? Okay, and these are 3 different allergy and tolerance resources. So what we could do is basically use this code as an ID, if you want, or as an identifier for the allergy and tolerance resource. That's already getting a bit tricky, but that will mostly work, actually. Now, provenance has a role to play here. Because let's say we receive 3 allergies from the lab system and we receive 2 allergies from the ADT system. In your CDR, you're probably going to store all 5. So you somehow have to maintain the fact that you received those 3 from the lab system and the other 2 were received from the ADT system. So if the lab system, after this message, sends you another message that contains a different list of allergies, that you actually know, oh, wait a second, lab has sent me 3, but now they're sending me 2, and it's from the same lab system. So what they're really doing is inactivating one of the allergies. Right? Provenance has a role to play there. You know provenance probably in FHIR, where did this come from? Or who edited this thing? So what you can do is basically, if I have my allergies, and here we have the 3 allergies, I can have a provenance that basically points, this is the provenance, and it points to the actor that is responsible for these resources. And in this case, that's a device, the software device that is identified by MSH3, the name of the sending application. So if I know that, then if I receive a new message from this very same source and it contains different allergies, then I know which one to set to inactive. But this means what I really have to do is first go to my CDR and see, well, okay, from the lab system we currently have 3 allergies, and then I look at my message, there are only 2 in there. So this means that I now have to first go to the CDR before I decide what to do exactly and how to translate this set of segments from version 2. But that means I can no longer use a transaction, because a transaction is a one-way mechanism. You translate the message into a transaction, you have it executed on the CDR, done. But now I found that there is a use case where I first have to go to the CDR and then decide exactly how I'm going to do the translation. In other words, conclusion, transactions, probably not. You could. It depends a bit on your use case, and if you have a simple use case and some simple ADT messages, you may be able to get away with that. But in general, that doesn't really help you that much. Okay, let's look at the more realistic scenario. Okay, so this is the image that we saw before. We have an ADT feed, we have a lab feed, we have some transformation software, and we update our CDR. But at the same point in time, let's say we have an app or an EHR system that supports FHIR, and they are also exchanging and updating this very same FHIR store. But that means that as a translation system, I have no full control over what happens there. So again, I will have to inspect more or less what's already there before I can merge the existing information with the new data that I'm receiving in the version 2 messages. So again, transactions, probably not. So you need to do some updating of stuff that's already there. And in FHIR we have a very nice mechanism for that not a lot of people use. And I'm actually pretty grateful that not a lot of people use that. That's the patch. That's not post or put, but it's patch. So you can actually update one single data element in a FHIR resource while leaving the rest alone. But then you already have to be pretty sure what you're doing and what the destination format actually is. Because otherwise this is relatively dangerous. You're just basically data that came from somewhere else and you're just overriding one data element. That sounds rather tricky, right? So don't do that. Now in HL7 version 2 we have our special values, the double quote, which is update to be empty, the null, which is a bit of a misleading name because it just means there is no value, or the unknown, so the pipe and the hat. So how do we support that? Well, if you do a patch, then you can actually do both. So, given that, let's update our diagram again, because the key thing here tends to be this process, the merge logic. How are you going to merge the current data with the data that we have mapped from the HL7 version 2 messages? And normally, and that's what I suggested initially, it would be nice if you can basically send these FHIR resources to a FHIR API that goes through the business process API of the receiving application, and it has its own merge logic and probably its own database schema. That would be the best route possible. But obviously that requires you to have a vendor that has already implemented all of that. If that's not the case, then maybe you could put a merge logic, let's say, combined with the persistence layer, or you could outsource the merge logic to the mapping solution. That gives you a lot of flexibility, but also a lot of responsibilities to basically get it right. And as you have seen by now, this is by no means an easy process. Now, we have seen some even more elaborate implementations of this, where then the translation system says, well, given that I have to merge, what I'm going to do is translate all the version 2 content into FHIR, put that in kind of a staging area FHIR repository, and then basically start looking at what's already there, merge it, and send the merged stuff over there. Because what they do is, it's a bit like Kafka, they maintain a list of events, trigger events in version 2 in this specific case, over time. And that means that you can also do event replay, or if messages were received in the wrong order, you can undo and redo. So that creates even more power in what you're able to do as a translation agent. But it's not a simple transaction anymore. Now, some advanced issues. Okay. In REST, if you send a bucket load of resources, then obviously the server, because it's client-side orchestration, then the server has to accept all these updates, given that you have the access rights and that sort of stuff. But in principle, the client is in the driver's seat. But here in our translator, we may actually be a bit selective. So if we receive, let's say, patient data from the lab system, or we receive an allergy from the ADT system, you may or may not wish to accept that, depending on whether they are the master over that particular category of data. It could be part again of this $process message, but again, that just shifts the burden of who has to deal with this to some other system, if it's not in the translation system. Another nice feature, and we have seen that quite often, and you notice that if you start listening to an ADT feed, then mostly the PID segment will be exactly the same. So there is no use in basically translating it again and again and again and again. So we had a system that basically grabbed the PID segment from the message and basically did a string comparison with the previous PID that they received for this patient from the same source. If it was the same string, we're not going to do anything. We're just going to skip the segment. And that saves a lot of messaging. And remember, if you use a FHIR server-based CDR, then it may be versioned. So if you send the patient again and again and again, you create 10,000 versions of one patient resource on your CDR. It still counts to your database size, right? So be careful. Okay, some other stuff, concurrency and out-of-order messages. That's obviously going to happen. Messaging is, as you well know, pretty tolerant to these things. But you have to deal with that because REST is the state of the world. So we really want to keep things in sync and process everything in order. So if you have this kind of scenario, where we have an ADT A02 followed by an ADT A04 and an ORM 001, then these are the trigger event times, and these are the times that the messages were actually received. Then obviously you see that 2 messages are out of order. So how do you deal with that? Well, you can receive your version 2 messages and just wait for a minute before actually processing them. Sometimes that's already sufficient to take care of the most of the out-of-order issues. Or if you have this rather elaborate event stack mechanism, then you can just shuffle your events around and replay them to the CDR. Now, this translator, the version 2 to FHIR bridge, yeah, well, you may wish to use all sorts of ETL mechanisms as well, because version 2 messages tend to be less rich in detail than FHIR is. So if you have an MPI, use that to basically cleanse basically the PID segment. If you have a terminology server, add display names. Okay, so you can sort of, but that's normal data cleansing techniques that you can just apply here. Deduplication, I spoke to that. Deduplication, try to have it as early in the pipeline as possible. But you have to take into account that however hard you try, you're going to create duplicates. Because identity management is such a nightmare, there's no way you can get that perfect. So you better also have a deduplication mechanism after the fact on your CDR and run that periodically. Now to show you what size we're talking about, this is from a Google presentation, I think from 2 years back, which was also about translation of version 2 to FHIR. And they said for a typical US provider organization, what are we looking at? Well, 5 million HL7 version 2 messages per day. And I checked that with some large hospitals in Europe, and they seem to be sort of in the same ballpark numbers. And if you translate that, then it's about 2,000 FHIR resources per second. So we're talking about, in terms of data size, as it's shown here, 73 terabytes per year. It's a sizable volume of messages and FHIR resources that we're talking about. So again, deduplication as early as possible in the pipeline is certainly advantageous, if only for performance reasons. So to summarize, version 2 to FHIR, there's lots of active work in this area. So we have HL7 itself that creates and also ballots these mappings in spreadsheets and in a special version 2 to FHIR implementation guide. And that's slowly being progressed. If you look at the mapping itself, as mentioned here, although it was the favorite option of you here in the room, translating version 2 messages to FHIR messages is actually something that I've rarely seen. FHIR messaging tends to be not that popular, but you can. It's certainly easier. Map to FHIR server, something we've commonly seen. Transaction, as I told you, probably not, but only if you have a simple use case. And if you are dealing with RESTful FHIR, RESTful CDR, then you have complex merge logic, where identity management is the main nightmare, as I told you. With FHIR to version 2 mapping, the main challenge is event detection. You've got this database that's chock-a-block with all sorts of FHIR resources, and how do you detect new patient admitted, or lab result updated, or so the usual version 2 trigger events, how do you detect them in a FHIR context? And for some things it's easy, but there are quite a few version 2 trigger events that are quite difficult, if not impossible, to detect if you're just passively looking at a FHIR resource repository. There is, however, a talk later today at 5 minutes to 3 at 2:55, which is the mapping of HL7 version 2 events to FHIR. It's a community talk, so 20 minutes, so if you have an interest in that, I'll certainly be there. I'll be curious to see what they have to say. But that's the mapping in the other direction. All right, so I hope with that you've seen at least some of the best practices and challenges around the mapping of HL7 version 2 to FHIR. Thank you. We have some time, so I would actually be curious maybe for somebody who filled in the poll that we're going to do version 2 message to FHIR message mapping. Could you elaborate as to why you chose to actually do that? Or are you going to do it, or have you already done it? Has somebody already done this, version 2 messages to FHIR messages? Ah, we have at least 2 or 3 people who have done this, right. Well, then I can ask you, okay, any questions or comments related to what I have just shown you?
Well, I was just going to say the other thing that...
Just wait for the mic a sec.
I was going to say the other thing that we run into are not completely populated HL7 v2 messages. And so trying to figure out when you have, if you were trying to, you know, align with US Core 3.1.1 and it requires a field, where do we get a date of service or something like that if it's not included? Or the other thing is fragments, where we get a name of a practitioner and that's it, and that's not sufficient to create an instance. So those are just kind of some of the ones that we struggle with, in addition to everything that you talked about.
And how do you, if you have a fragment, do you then, for let's say this practitioner, do you then translate it into a contained resource? Or,
Well, no, we don't use contains. We use the very esoteric .display of a reference and put the name in there.
It's actually quite common, yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, that's where we put it. Now, when we go to persist it, it does become more of a problem because, so there what we had to do is, as you persist FHIR, you have to create a database layout for it. So all of our references have not just, they have, you know, even though it may look like .practitioner or .performer, you have performer ID, performer, logical ID and the pieces of that, and then performer display. And then whichever one we get is what we populate.
I was interested to hear about the deletion job approach. And I'm interested because it seems like that has some consequences. Like if you have, say, 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 practitioner resources and you're deduplicating those, then you'd pick one that's like the master, and then all the resources that reference those other 10,000, you have to update the references to point to that master, which would trigger last updated on those resources and like trigger subscriptions for all, notifications for all those if there's subscriptions in place. So it seems like, do those deduplication jobs like have a feature of skipping last updated and subscription notification content?
Good question. In other words, I don't have the answer to that, but it's, you may not have subscriptions, so this is not a relevant issue for some people, but yeah, it is a side
Just
effect.
a comment on these problems. And I think they are not something that FHIR created. If we close our eyes and think of anything else that you can create to do this same job, you will have the same problems. Because information is incomplete or it's not aligned. So it's not a problem of FHIR, it's a problem of the world.
That's certainly true, but you know, we're technology people in this room, so we try to solve it anyway using standards. But you know, you cannot standardize everything. We all know that. Thanks, Diego. Anything else?
You're here. Very valuable insights. I love the implementation choices, those details, those tips. Thank you for those. I realized that in the HL7 website, we have mappings that we can go publicly available. I was wondering if you're part of the work group that creates those mappings and if those considerations were actually taken into consideration when they were published in the website.
Oh, the work group for orders and observations is in the lead on this.
Are you part of it or exchange? Are you part of it and are you exchanging information with them so that the mapping
Well,
is in
anybody
there?
can. You can on the HL7 website. You can just find out who the leadership is. And by the way, the implementation guide probably also mentions some contacts where you can get hold. They have their own channel on chat.fhir.org. There's also a separate channel on chat.fhir.org, which is called V2 to FHIR. So that's only about translation issues. So if you have any comments or suggestions, that's probably the place to go to. These mappings are not perfect, by the way, because we know very well you will always, it's kind of the framework mapping, a starter version. But in your context, because there's so many dialects of version 2, you will also always have to tweak that to fit with your particular dialect of version 2. Sometimes we get these emails like, okay, give us the mapping, and then we'll create a mapping for all segments in version 2. Well, for some segments there is no mapping because nobody uses the segment in practice. So then you can see that people are speaking theoretically only. But there is no perfect mapping. We cannot create that, but we can give you a very good 95% plus guidance as to how to do a best mapping.
These segments.
Well, earlier on there was a comment on I'm going to translate to, let's say, US core. And what we have seen is sometimes that the effect is that if you know that you have to translate to US core and you know that some data is missing, you may wish to basically contact the vendor, let's say it's a lab vendor that sends version 2, and go like, dear lab vendor, you now have to add a new data element so I can decently translate that to US core. And sometimes that means that you have to add a new Z or Z segment to your version 2 message so that you get hold of a new data element. So sometimes you see that these requirements in FHIR sort of have a backwards effect on how we use HL7 version 2.
I was just interested for your mapping questions, because I know that I think it's like 2 different mappings to V2. There's like the mapping tab in the resource page for the FHIR spec, and then there's the V2 to mapping project. Was it, do you know which one you were? Yeah, because like on the FHIR page, those are things, as a work group.
Oh, well.
As a work group co-chair, I think about those a little bit, but I feel like the V2 to mapping project has done a much more comprehensive analysis, so that's probably the place to look for that mapping.
It's good to point that out. Yes, in the FHIR specification, if you go to a resource, there is a mapping tab, but that's only for the reader. It's sort of a very high level. This is sort of the thing that you should think about when you read this FHIR specification. But that's not a computable mapping at all. It's not detailed. It's just documentation, high level. The other project is much more refined.
You haven't discussed, or maybe you discussed elsewhere, the tools you use to do the actual translation, to go from the pipes and hats to something to the FHIR format, to JSON. Anything that you have discovered, or any tools that you prefer, or you are just coding?
Well, the thing is, there are plenty of communication servers, or whatever you want to call them, middleware applications that are specialized in translations, commercial openings, open source offerings. So I would assume that people who like GUI-based translations will probably be using those tools. Most of the flexibility and performance is obviously going to be achieved if you just hard code this. Because if you try to do this generically in code, it actually bloats your solution enormously. So you have much more flexibility. So I did this just for fun. I did it in Python. But actually the size of the code is actually not that large. So it's actually quite doable because you have ultimate flexibility. But obviously going forward, if then suddenly your version 2 feeds change, then you have to basically start all over again. So it's a one-off solution. So it depends a bit, it depends on the context. But I think some level of coding is unavoidable. Even if you have a GUI-based mapping tool, that's not going to cut it. It's a fair percentage that you will have to do with some scripting or programming extensions on the GUI-based mappers. Especially this whole thing of first having to fetch, inspect what's on the CDR, and then merging that. So this merging process, that's something that most of these GUI-based or the out-of-the-box communication servers don't do at this point in time. They're just one direction, but they're not first pull, update. That's a level of complexity that I haven't seen. There may be some tools out there, but no. If there's nothing else, then thanks for being here. It's always good to see the pipehead crowd at a FHIR conference. So enjoy the rest of your day, and by all means, join us in the version 2 to FHIR session later today. See you around, and enjoy the remainder of the conference. Cheers.